Konnichiwa, and welcome to the Onyx Tavern. I'm your host, Rick the Bard, keep bringing you episode 193 here at the Tavern, presented by HeroTaku.com. So here we are, a stone's throw away from the end of Zoologer. And frankly, folks, it's okay. It's not really that good, but it's also not really that bad. The season seems to be playing it safe for the most part. And I'm not here to really talk about all the things that are wrong with Zoologer. I mean, it's just choices here and there that I don't particularly agree with. They take the story and characters in directions that don't seem to make sense. And when they actually get onto something that might be interesting and worth exploring, they just kind of go in an opposite direction and forget about any dramatic potential that they had there. But that's a video for another time. What I want to focus on today is an element of the problem with Zoologer that I think is a problem with many other Super Sentai series, particularly within the last decade. And that problem, as I see it, are our villains. Now, they say that a hero is only as interesting as the villain in which they face. I mean, we can think of many superheroes out there with great villains and great rogues galleries. I mean, you got Batman and the Joker, the Ninja Turtles and Shredder. But, when you don't have a good villain to put our heroes up against, the stories are not always that interesting. Case in point, the first two Turtle movies, which featured the Shredders as the main antagonists, were great films, but Ninja Turtles 3 and TMNT, which did not have the Shredder as a villain, were pretty subpar and mediocre. Then again, the last two Ninja Turtle movies did have the Shredder in both of them, and they're horrible, but then you have the X Factor of Michael Bay in there. But I digress. Okay, but how am I relaying this to Sentai and the villains there? In theory, there's nothing really wrong with our villains here. A bunch of bored assholes on a spaceship that want to cause the most death and destruction. They view human life as a game, as extra points in Grand Theft Auto. I can get behind that. There's a great allegory there, or parallels to real life of the gaming culture or the perception of the gaming culture. But the series never really explores that. They really don't even give it lip service whatsoever. That's really kind of something that I'm seeing in it, but again, I kind of digress. No, the problem with the villains, I think, and again, this is something that's been going on for at least the last decade in Sentai, is that the villains are not interesting because they're people in rubber suits. Now, I know that sounds odd given what the Sentai franchise is based on, but follow me on this here. I've been going back and forth between a lot of the older Sentai and the newer Sentai in effort to kind of catch up on them. I've been going back watching Die Ranger and Jetman and Liveman, and of course I've been keeping up with Ninja and Zoologer, and this is, the last couple of years basically. So I've been going back and forth from a classic series to a current series and so forth. And I've started to notice some patterns in them, mainly like the evolution of the series, things they do different now that they did not do in the 80s, or stuff in the 80s that they would never do today, things like that. And what I've noticed is a consistency with the villains that has died down in recent years. I'm going to base it on this supposition, that I believe the most interesting and best Super Sentai seasons are the ones in which the villains are human characters in armor or makeup, as opposed to actors in rubber suits that are completely covering them. Now, I don't know what the official term is here, but for the purposes of this video, when I refer to a face villain or face character, I'm referring to characters where you see their face entirely and they got, prosthetics and makeup on and things like that to cover up part of them. And I'm going to refer to as a rubber-suited villain as that villain that is completely covered, and you can't tell who's in the suit, basically. Now, here's the thing. As a monster of the day kind of thing, the rubber suit villain, that works fine for the purposes that we have. I don't think there was too much complexity needed for the villain of Pudgy Pig, whether it's in Zyuranger or Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. It's a monster that eats everything, and you don't need to be a face villain. But when you have a major antagonist of the series, Giving them a human face to work off on, for them to emote and to actually, act, goes a long way in helping with characterization. Let me give you guys a couple examples here. First of all, what is probably the most popular Sentai of all time? Probably Jetman, if not Gokaiger, but we'll get to that here in a second. And what is one thing that Jetman really has going for it? It has great characters, not only for our five heroes, but for our villains as well. With the exception of Gray, all the villains in Jetman are face characters. You have Maria, you have Trans, you in the Radagat, I believe is his name. Oh, I know I'm saying that wrong. They're all face villains, and they're really good. They're what makes the series interesting. From Trans being that spoiled brat to becoming an adult and trying to gain favor with the villains, to Radagat and his insane motivations, Maria and her struggles with humanity and her old life, and even Gray, who again is in this case a rubber suited villain. He had great characterization, but part of that was that he was playing off of the other characters. And that episode arc with Radagat, as when he became human, lost his memories, and kind of fell in love with that girl, that was amazing. But they were able to do that because he was actually an actor acting, as opposed to, say, a stunt person in a rubber suit. Um, and again, look at some other shows that we have. Now, I haven't finished Live Man yet, but Dr. Oda, I believe. And again, I know I'm getting these names wrong. I apologize for that. But he turns into that rubber suited monster, like after the first couple of episodes of Live Man. Then when he reverts and go on this arc that he might not be the smartest genius, we get into his past about his childhood and everything. And then we meet his mother and his wish to be human again. That's compelling stuff. But when he's in the monstrous form, we're not really getting that. It's only when he reverts back to human is when we actually get some interesting stories with him. Now, I haven't finished out that season, so I don't exactly know what's going to happen next. I'm sure I will go ahead and find out as I continue to go ahead and watch it. But those are older Sentai seasons. Let's take a look at maybe some current ones so I can give you guys a little bit of what I'm talking about. Now, I will point out that the majority of the Sentai that I've seen has been Geiki Ranger on out. So basically everything within the last 10 years I have seen in its entirety. So I'm going to base a lot of what I'm telling you guys based on everything since Geiki Ranger. But again, since I did bring up Live Man and Jetman, and I have seen both Zoo Ranger and Dire Ranger in their entirety, and I believe the same holds true there, because you do have mainly face characters in Dire Ranger as the villains, and the way those villains are turned out was pretty good. And Dire Ranger was an overall good season. Zoo Ranger, which I think was a great season as well, did have Witch Bandora as a face villain and Lammy, but again, you did have rubber suited monsters in there, but they did play off the human characters, and of course you had Barai, and when he was a villain and stuff. So the point is, when you have human characters in the cast playing your antagonists, they're just overall better. And again, let me kind of illustrate that with recent Sentai. So again, Geiki Ranger. Geiki Ranger was the first full Sentai that I ever watched, and this was, I believe, after I had seen Jungle Fury, and I was kind of unimpressed with Jungle Fury. So maybe I'm a little, my view is a little bit skewed coming off Jungle Fury, which I did not enjoy. Watching it at the same time RPM was out, which I definitely did not enjoy. I just really enjoyed Geiki Ranger, and part of the reason was Rio and Melee as the villains. They were just awesome. Rio is great. I love Melee. I love the relationship, and I just love how they kind of played in her whole he resurrected her, now she's madly in love thing. And I think the reason that worked out so well is because they did have two really good actors playing those roles. Now, you contrast that with some of the other characters that we had in the series, the other villains who were human before, but let's be honest, these and again, I can't remember the Japanese names for them, but the overlords, Grisaka, Jellica, Carnosaur, and so forth. They were not very interesting villains in their own right. What made them interesting is, one, their backstory with Scratch and Master Lee. Yeah, yeah, Lee. I'm sorry, I had to think about that for a second. And Shafu. And then, of course, a relationship that they had with Rio and Melee. But again, by themselves, just their characters were not very interesting. They were supplemented by other people and real people acting off of them. So again, I think that they were great villains to go ahead and have and made a great season. Go on to the next one that I did see. You had the main villainess, but rubber suit monsters. And again, villains were not the strong point of Go Andra. I think Go Andra was a decent season. I think it's a lot better than some of the ones that we have now, but the villains were not very strong. And, again, we only had one actress who was playing off of two rubber suited guys, and there really wasn't much drama with her until the end of the season, and of course the infamous episode where they tried to form a girl group, but that's a story for another time. Shinkanger, we had the Juzo character, but again, you look at the main villains, the Xandrid counterpart, and the Dayu counterpart, they were not very interesting. Now, what made the Dayu's counterpart more interesting was her backstory, and when we actually got to see it, when she was human and the betrayal that she went through. When we take a look at Juzo when he is human, because when he interacts in his human form with the others, that stuff is good. But as soon as he dons that rubber mask, he becomes less of an interesting character. Um, and then take a look at Ghost Sager. Ghost Sager had four different factions of villains, and none of them were really interesting. And that really translated over into Megaforce. Um, Again, if Ghost Sager maybe had a human character to play off of, it would have probably been a much better season. But I just four faction villains, and none of them were particularly that interesting, except for our Messiah character at the end, who used to be human, but we never even got to see him in a human form. Gokaiger would be the anomaly here, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say that what made Gokaiger at least popular by a lot of people, again, was not the villains, but was the Gokai changes, because that's, frankly, what a lot of people really remember about that show is the Gokai changes and not much else. I mean, honestly, what can you tell me about the villains other than Bosco? And the reason I bring up Bosco is because we get to see him in a human form, then he has his monstrous form. Okay? Alright, then we got Go Busters, which, again, the first half of that season was great with Enter and Escape in human form. But as the series kind of progressed, Enter kept getting these alternate forms where he was covered up and, he was the rubber suit monster. Escape was the same way. She wasn't as compelling a villain when she would put on for the action sequences. And, what's really odd is when we actually have those characters show up in later seasons, Bosco included, we see him briefly as human, and I think one of the crossovers, I'm forgetting which one, I think it was the Go Buster, Go Kaiger crossover, and they weren't, or Kyoger crossover, I'm thinking. They were not that interesting because they didn't get a chance to act. And then, of course, in the Zuozer Gokaiger crossover, they're not as interesting either because they're just the rubber suits. Granted, they're just the avatars in the memories of them, but again, not very interesting. Kyoger, Candarella, she was interesting, but again, I kind of enjoyed her more in her human form because she would act off our Blue Ranger, and there was a budding relationship between the two of them, so I really liked that. But as far as the other characters, again, there wasn't much there. We get to Tokuger and we get Zet, and he is by far the most interesting of the villains, but then Madame Noir and Schwartz and Glitter and I'm sorry, Zet was interesting when he was first introduced. There was so much potential in his character, but then he just sat around doing nothing through the majority of the series. And even when he does interact with the other characters, I mean, there's absolutely no chemistry between him and Glitter throughout the series at all. And while they were trying to build something with Shorts and Glitter, I just couldn't see it. There was just nothing that was interesting about what was happening between them. But if Glitter was being portrayed by an actual actress and Schwartz was by, an actual, older, actor, that would have been awesome. We could have actually seen something. I mean, I imagine that if this was an 80s Sentai, we would have had Glitter played by maybe some 15, 16-year-old girl, and Schwartz played by a man in his 50s, late 40s, early 50s, something like that, to compare and contrast. And, you get that meek new actress compared to this, grizzled veteran in a way, which would have been a great dynamic and probably would have come out better. But as his, with the two rubber suited characters, it's just not working. They really needed a face. Ninja, exactly the same. The villains were really not that interesting at all, and they needed a human villain. Again, we got a couple of episodes where they had human disguises, but beyond that, our main antagonist of the series used to be human, but we only get to see his human form in flashbacks, and then he's reincarnated as a woman in the, well, not so much reincarnated, but he possesses a woman in the spin-off or the epilogue film. That's what I'm thinking of. But again, just not interesting. And again, we get to Zoolger. I think the most interesting of all the characters thus far is probably Bangre, but that's only because he's engaging our characters on an emotional level. While the others are content on destruction and mayhem and just killing people or doing weird things to them, Bangre, who is a hunter, by the way, is thinking strategically and trying to, I believe, as Osborn put in the first Spider-Man movie, to attack the heart. And that was the Goblin, but you guys get my point there. Because I think the most cruel thing that he did do was basically kill the avatar of Yamato's mother. And that was certainly strong, but only because of Yamato's reaction. If, Bangre was actually a human character who he could interact with on a personal level, it makes the character much more interesting. Again, think back to Gokaiger. If Bosco was just his red-suited, rubber-faced form the entire time, and, Marvelous had to act off that, it wouldn't have been as interesting, and the betrayal would not be as clear as opposed to, an actual human face, which is why that dynamic did work. So again, I just basically went through the last 10 years of Sentai to basically explain to you guys that the rubber suit monsters don't work. I mean, honestly, in the last 10 years, since Geki Ranger, have we really had very strong or interesting villains? On occasion, yes. As a whole, absolutely not. I think that if we had stronger villains in Zoozor this season, I think it would have been a lot better. Same thing with Ninja. If Zet could have done more in Tokuger, or maybe surrounded himself with, more human-faced characters. And that gets to the heart of this, because I'm actually trying to figure out where that change took place. Because, again, up until, I would say, the last 10, 15 years, the majority of Sentai has had, at least one or two faced villains on their roster. You look at, Abba Ranger had that, Hurricane Ranger had that, Gower Ranger had that, Time Ranger, I think Go-Go 5 had that, Ginga Man, Mega Ranger, Car Ranger. I think O-Ranger was probably the only one that didn't, and believe it or not, the villains actually were pretty good in terms of Zeo, but I haven't seen O-Ranger yet. That DVD is coming soon. I pre-ordered it. And again, I haven't got a chance to watch any of Kaku Ranger as of yet. Okay, but again, the seasons that, again, we used to have at least one character, and again, in 80s Sentai, we had almost all the characters were face villains, and Die Ranger, all of them were face villains. Even that little brat was a face character. But now there seems to be a shift in that, and I really started to think why that is. Why is it that we're getting all these rubber face villains and we're not getting face villains for our characters? How come they're not hiring more actors and actresses to play the villains in these shows? Now, when I kind of thought of it as like, maybe it's a budgetary reason. Because here's the thing. When you hire a face villain, you're going to hire them to obviously go ahead and act on the set scenes and interact with our heroes, of course. But 9 times out of 10, you're going to have to go ahead and get a stunt actor or actress to go ahead and perform the roles with the explosions and the actions and the kicking, when the main actor can't go ahead and do it. There are a few cases in which these actors can go ahead and do that. I mean, for example, in Gigaman, our female antagonist, believe it or not, was a porn star before she did Gigaman, and I kind of doubt she has the ability to do a lot of those actions and flips and kicks and whatever it is she needs to do to fight the Gigaman. That's nothing against porn stars or anything. It just that wasn't in her resume to begin with. So they obviously had to hire a second actress or multiple actresses to play that role. But that logic kind of breaks down when, one, every ranger has a stunt double in their suit, so it's not like, because you have like 7 or 8 rangers per season now, so what's one more face villain going to go ahead and do to the budget? Plus, if you think about it too, the act in Zoologer, just as an example, the actors who are voicing the characters are not playing them in their suit roles. So what you actually have here is that you have the stunt actor playing them in the suit, 100% of the time, and you have voice actors on a soundstage somewhere else doing the dialogue, of course. It's not like the stunt actors are doing the voiceovers as well, because that would be the way to do it, I would suppose, is that you get the stunt actor to do the suit and to go ahead and do the dialogue, because it does seem in a lot of seasons that that's what they do. They get an actor for the suit, or they get the stunt actor, and they get the actual actor to do the dialogue and all the, acting stuff as opposed to the action stuff. Very rarely do we actually get that within Power Rangers as well. Roger Vlisco, I believe famously, he did his own stunts. Whether they were as the Black Ranger or not, I'm not exactly sure, but I do know he did his own stunts. And of course, the original Rangers, a lot of those guys, I think Austin St. John and David Yost, they did a lot of their stunts as well. The point I'm getting at is that I don't think it's a budgetary reason. It really isn't. Is that if you hire a face actor and stunt actor, it's probably going to cost you just as much to hire a voiceover actor and a stunt actor. So why are they not doing it? Is it to maybe put more focus on our heroes? I could see that because there are a lot of seasons where, maybe the villains do outshine the heroes. Again, back to Geiki Ranger. I remember more about Rio and Melee from that season than I remember about Ran and Jan and everybody else in that. I really think that the villains do outshine them, and for good reason, because they're well written and well acted, and they have great story arcs, as opposed to our heroes who are kind of on the bland side, but are a lot more interesting than maybe some of the later Sentai characters that we've gotten. I guess another way is to not incur sympathy for those characters. I mean, I'm not sure here because the thing is, most Sentai villains by the end of the series are going to be killed off. There are a few exceptions in which they do get to live, but I would say at least 90% of the main gang of villains are killed off in some capacity. Now, a lot of the human villains do end up surviving in one form or another. Now, Rio and Melee did die by the end of the series, of course, but they've been resurrected a number of times for further crossovers and other adventures. Once again, I'd like to see the episode where Guy goes to hell to try and get their Ranger keys. um, but here's the thing: is that if you do have sympathy for a villain, it's really hard for you to see them die and you have that emotional connection. So maybe there's something going on where they don't want you to have that emotional connection with the characters. Because, here's the thing. If Schwartz was played by an actual actor, his death probably would have meant a lot more than it did in the series. His death did mean something, but without an actor there to put that emotional weight to it, an actual, I guess, soul, because when we see a face we actually see a soul, but without that face, it's just a kind of rubber costume. Again, it just doesn't have that weight to it. I mean, I'm really speculating here, folks. I have no idea why this is becoming a trend. It doesn't honestly seem like it's any type of, way to save money. It's not really putting a lot of focus on our heroes because, again, as I've always said, if you want to put focus on our heroes, don't show the villains at all. Again, I want a season where we don't have any villain scenes. I mean, again, how much more interesting would Zolger actually be if we never saw the villains interact with each other or knew what their motivations were? If they just show up and we just get the perception of what's going on with our heroes. I mean, that's a way to go ahead and save the budget and do what you guys want to go ahead and do. But I mean, because right now with where we are in Zolger, do we really need to see what the Death Galleon is up to? I mean, all they're doing is drinking and talking about their plans and stuff, and it's just not that interesting. Again, Bangre made it interesting, but he interacted with our heroes. Kubal, I believe is, again, how you pronounce his name, the yellow guy. There is this backstory that's developing where his planet was destroyed by the Blood Game, and we don't know what exactly he's planning now that he has Bangre's severed hand. But I would imagine whatever comes of his storyline would be a lot more powerful and a lot more interesting if he's played by a face villain. If he actually had a face. As a rubber suited monster, I have no real sympathy or empathy, or I'm just not really interested in him as a villain right now. Even though his story does sound interesting, I'm curious on where it's going to go. But if he was an actual person, I would definitely enjoy it a lot more. Now, a lot of what I've said can apply to Power Rangers, of course. And, somebody actually did. This was like part of the reason I'm talking about this is something like this was kind of brought up on a forum one time. And I don't remember the exact conversation that was had, but it had something to do with the fact that is it possible that Sentai is limiting their face villains in an attempt to make adaptation easier for Power Rangers? That was kind of the comment that was made. Now, of course, that's obviously not what they're doing, but is an interesting correlation to draw in the fact that they haven't had many face villains in recent years, and thus Power Rangers has had to develop face villains for the series most of the time. Obviously, they didn't do it in Mega Force or Super Mega Force, and they've done in Dino Charge. I mean, they made Sledge, who is a rubber villain, but obviously for an American audience, and then they made Snide and Heckle. We got Face, and then it goes into a costume form. Not that I'm enjoying their brand of villainy as it is right now. But again, even taking a look at older seasons, as I said before, they've had to adapt those characters. They had to get, Nadira and Viper and get an actress in there. Although, frankly, you could always excise the villains completely, which they did, of course, in Dino Thunder, where they didn't use any of the Sentai villains and, of course, developed Mesogog and Elsa and so forth. But again, getting into the Power Ranger stuff is a little bit different. But again, why is it that there is this trend going on that every villain has to be a rubber suited villain, and the exception now is that human interaction? What I'm hoping that we get in the future, and specifically with Q Ranger coming up as the next season, I want to see humans. I want to see people with faces as our next set of villains. I want to see personal connections with the villains. Again, going back to Live Man, one of the things that's making that series interesting for me as we go along is that there are personal connections. I mean, the six, our three villains and our three heroes, they were all friends and colleagues when they were scientists, but then the three bad guys had to go and sell their souls to the devil, as the credits tell us every week, and murder two of their friends. So there's an interesting dynamic there because they are human, but if they started out as rubber suited monsters, it wouldn't have been as interesting, of course. So again, I really want to know why this is. Why is it this trend that we're basically neutering our villains? We're making them less interesting. Now, can you have a rubber suited villain be an interesting villain? Absolutely. I mean, Rio Revolto. That's a great example. That's from Power Rangers, of course, but that was a rubber suited villain, never had human form, and he was a great character. I love Rito, but it was all in the delivery and the acting and all that kind of stuff. But with Sentai, I don't know. I just kind of want to see what they're going to do moving forward, and I would definitely like to see changes made in the series. Let's get some humans in there. Let's get them interacting with our heroes more. Let's make the thing a little bit more personal. Even if you don't want to have personal, relationships between them, having the villain come down and taunt them or talk to them directly is very interesting. I mean, Cubel or the other villains aren't really interacting with our Zoolger, and they're just not that interesting. Whereas, again, let's go back to Geiki Ranger. You have our Red Ranger and Rio going at each other, and the Red Ranger trying to find redemption in him, and Rio just like, no, there's no redemption for me. Or again, back to Jetman, and Ryu is trying to get through to Maria to find the woman that he loves, and it's all the more painful for him. Again, things like that. That's the kind of stuff I would love to go ahead and see. But you could have never gotten that Maria dynamic from Jetman if she was completely covered head to toe and she didn't have a chance to use her face, to use her eyes. I mean, that's why LeVar Burton was arguing for years to get rid of Geordi's visor so he can use his eyes to actually act. But again, I digress there. Okay, so I've rambled on, but I'd like to think that I gave you guys some good examples of what I'm talking about. You may disagree and maybe think some villains were a little bit stronger than others, but again, who was the strongest villain in Gokaiger? Bosco. Why? Because he actually interacted with our heroes, and he had a face where he could actually talk to Marvelous. Zet was the strongest in Tokuger. Well, he would have been if he actually had done something, and well, again, the ninja villains are just kind of Ghost Ranger villains, Shinkanger villains, Ranger villains. Awesome! Because, again, of the acting. So that's all I got. What do you guys think? What are your opinions on this? Do you know why they're not using face villains anymore? Why it's all rubber suited stuff? Is it a budgetary reason? Is it a story driven reason? What is it? Leave a comment below and let me know. Otherwise, I want to thank you guys for listening. Have a good evening. And the tavern is now closed.